Hi, I'm Dr. William Starsiak and I'm an osteopath. I want to highlight one of the principles of osteopathy in this video. These principles, at first glance, can seem pretty simple, right? All four are structure and function are interrelated. The systems of the body are all one. The body has a self-healing mechanism, or is a self-healing mechanism, and appropriate treatment is based upon understanding the first three principles. So those are the four principles. And the one I want to focus on today is this principle about the systems of the body being one. So when we learn medicine, we learn different systems. We'll learn the cardiovascular system, the pulmonary system, the muscular system, the skeletal system. Heck, osteopathy is named for the sort of suffering that can come from an imbalance that mispositions elements of the skeletal system, right? Osteopathy, the suffering of the bones. And it's really helpful to begin to understand the body by looking at separate systems. But this principle in osteopathy, that all of those systems are one, makes it clear that we can't stop there if we want to be able to fully treat someone osteopathically. Because in reality, none of these systems are separate. Just as a tree doesn't exist in isolation, floating out in empty space. A tree is dependent upon certain conditions and arises when all of those conditions are met. A human body unfolds from a single cell that was the union of two other cells, right? The sperm and the ovum. When they come together, then you get a single cell, and then that single cell begins to divide. But those divisions are not separation. Those divisions actually serve the oneness of the organism, because the cell has a certain metabolism, right? It has a need to process energy. It doesn't exist without this process of energy acquisition and release. And that process, kind of like if you drive a car, you have exhaust. Well, there are metabolic byproducts inside of cells. And those byproducts are also taken into account in growth and development. So given the metabolism that that first cell has, it actually requires these cell divisions to maintain its oneness and its wholeness. So as that embryo develops, it can begin to look like, oh, there are separate systems in there. But all of these systems are just expression of the oneness of the organism, and they all work together. You can't take any one of those systems and have it live by itself. They all need each other. So when we're going to treat, if we conceptualize in our mind that the skeletal system is separate from the vascular system, well, then our hands won't actually interact properly with the structure. So we actually have to let those distinctions dissolve and directly go to the awareness of the sensory perception of the status of the patient. And that information comes in passively. And one way I think that people could understand what it's like to do osteopathic treatment is through looking at psychological treatment. One of the really cool things happening right now is more and more people are becoming aware of their personal psychological makeup. This is being popularized in different podcasts where you'll see, celebrities, comedians having discussions where they have identified some of their core habitual tendencies, psychological tendencies, and even talk about some of the roots of it, like traumas they had when they were a child, unmet needs in a parental relationship, and how these traumas then restricted their behavior in a certain way. It led to a type of compensation that then became part of their personality that was limiting in some ways, but in a comedian's case, they often end up benefiting from the effects of those traumas. They use it as the centerpiece for their comedy. Just the way they move in the world and look at the world is humorous, and it's informed in part by, how do they compensate for these traumas. So if you can appreciate that sort of dynamic, the psychological dynamic of how a trauma or a sort of repetitive formative force can require a compensation from the psyche that then becomes a little rigid in the sense that somebody can't really get away from it. It's persistent throughout their whole life. If you're familiar with the landmark forum, or originally this work was under the name of the EST technique, they talk about strong suits. A strong suit, like if someone's really funny, well, that's a strong suit. They develop that to get through some sort of traumatic experience. But then it becomes like they have to be funny. They can't be serious. It's hard for them to be serious. And so every strong suit compensation for some sort of trauma or difficulty actually is also restrictive. And this is really interesting because we see this same pattern show up physically. And that's why I'm talking about this in connection with this principle of the unity of the body systems. So I assert that that principle truly doesn't stop at the physical anatomy, but it actually extends into all dimensions of a human being's reality, really of all beings' reality, that our emotions, our mentality, our spirituality, these are all part of the same event. The physicality is part of that same event. So if you have a spiritual crisis, you can get sick. If you experience something like a cancer, where you're facing your own death, you may have a spiritual crisis over the meaning of life. If you have some sort of mental perplexity, well, it shows up physically if you're engaged in some sort of like mental perplexity. If you have depression, right, that shows up physically in the body. Versus if you have a lot of joy and confidence, that shows up as well. So we can see that these all connect with each other. And I think it's pretty easy to understand that they're all a single event. None of them exist in isolation. And then we can talk about like, how do you work with it? So the other three principles are important then. Structure and function is interrelated, and the body has a self-healing principle. The last one being you have to take these other three principles into account. So it's very similar to how a psychologist would work with someone with one of these traumatically induced restrictions in their sort of the expression of their psyche, where say someone has difficulty being vulnerable, they have difficulty sharing how they feel. Well, that's something a psychologist would work with them on to get them into, not just say, hey, just share how you feel and get over it. That's not how it works. There's a going down into it. Like the way out is actually in. And we can actually understand that psychological work now a little easier if we consider how it works physically. So physically, what needs to occur for a restriction to release and rebalance is it needs to be brought back to its neutral point, to its balance point. So the original ideal that will unfold if there are no traumas and there's the right amount of stimulus and challenge to the system, the right amount of nurturance, is that all of the different structures of the body exist in a very nice balance. And when someone disengages from activity, all of those structures idle in this neutral, this balance between sort of, all possibilities. So let's take side bending, for instance. The imagined ideal of the spine would be that when you let go of any sort of engagement or pursuing activity, that it goes to neutral at midline. It's not side bent right, it's not side bent left, it's not flexed forward or extended, but every joint relationship achieves a neutral synchronously with all of the other joint relationships. And so all of the conductive channels, nerves, veins, arteries, lymphatics, they're all unimpeded. And so there's full flow and integration in the system. The circle of ins and outs is uninterrupted, and the distinction between coming and going disappears into just this smooth circle, and there's a sense of fluid wholeness. A fluid wholeness that is radiant, that is expansive. But pretty much all of us, we have compensations, and we may only occasionally touch that sense of that expansive fluid wholeness in times of deep meditation, or even perhaps in some psychedelic therapies. A sense of that can begin to emerge. The fluidity of the system can increase. And this is actually the goal of some of those practices, is to return to a fluid state so that things can reform from that fluid state. But generally, we're all living in a sort of compensation. And we've mapped this out in osteopathy. There is a common compensation pattern where at the base of the head, like 90+